Good afternoon or evening, wherever you are, folks. This is the concluding part of our 12 days of shows with a variety of historians done about a variety of subjects. But I think this is a very important one to finish on because we've touched women in death camps. We've touched the Rochambeau, the second French Armored Division unit. We've talked about women in various varieties this week, but we're talking about African-American postal workers within the U.S. Army of World War II. So my guest, I'm really thrilled to have with us, Kaia Alderson, who is everything. You're a multi-talented writer, performer, novelist, blogger, comic books. There's many strings to your bow. So welcome to the show, Kaia. And
Thank you.
You have a book, not a novel, coming out in August this year about the 6AAA, and we'll talk later on about the choice of writing a novel as opposed to writing a history book. We'll talk about that later on. But before we get into the details of the unit, a little bit about yourself, please. How did you get involved in talking about the history of the unit?
In general, I am a Black women's history geek. So it all started with my dad just handing me a book on the history of the Harlem Renaissance. And I was like, oh, wow, Black people did this in the past. And from there, I've been hooked. With this particular project, I am not military at all. I basically was on Twitter one day and I saw a picture of the 6AAA marching in Rouen, France. And I was like, wait a minute, those are Black WACs. Why don't I know about them? And I just basically went digging and learned a little bit about them and just started writing. I have a background in writing romance, so that's originally what this book was supposed to be. And then it just the story is bigger than just between two people. So it morphed into basically women's historical fiction.
And again, we'll touch on that later on about historical fiction as compared to other parts of writing. But, it is... They have, as a unit, had a bit more press recently. In the last few years, more books have turned up. But for many years, I didn't know much about them. I think most people watching this didn't know much about the unit. So there's a lot of research material. That's one of the things. I do some shows where you Google the unit and nothing comes up at all, and other units where you put the Google in and Google kind of goes crazy. And there's actually quite a lot of information these days about the unit. So. But with that, is that sometimes an advantage or a disadvantage? Because if you're tackling something that other people have tackled, is it therefore sometimes difficult to find a new angle?
It is, because even with this novel, because it hasn't been touched, I kind of had to cram everything in it, and I couldn't just focus on the unit and what they did over in Europe. It was basically I had to go all the way back to the beginning of the WAC, the Women's Army Corps, to get a sense of why it was such a big deal. It helped to have other people's work out there because it is so scattered. You have information troves within the Women's Memorial Museum down in DC. You have Fort Des Moines in Iowa, and then also in Fort McClellan, where the Women's Military History Museum used to be before it went to DC. So it helped me, but even then I had to get creative because, as you can see in the picture, those are all the books that pretty much that I use to research just to get a sense of the time and place, as well as just what they were doing in the specific kernel of time as a Black woman in the military in the United States.
And I may ask this question again later on, but in reading these different books written over perhaps 20 or 30 years, I'm guessing they're also an indicator of the time in which they were written as well, in that the understanding of Black history is different now in 2021 than it was in 1971 or 1951. So it's important that a book like this be important for today as well as talking about the past, because it is an important story. And that's why I invited you on, because I didn't want some stuffy old English tweed wearing white guy talking about African American Youth World War II. It's inherently wrong, because we don't get the issues. So, you said in your little bit a minute ago that the Women's Army Corps had a very quick rise to prominence in World War II, really, because there wasn't a unit for women, and then kind of not reasonably quickly there was, and it was enormous. It went from nothing to tens of thousands very, very quickly. So to run through a little bit about the history of the WAC, and then we'll move on to the 6888.
Well, the reason it was able to come about so quickly in 1942 is because a lot of the groundwork had already been laid, even as early as towards the end of World War I, after U.S. women had achieved the right to vote. The U.S. Army started a women's division. It was basically a propaganda unit to inform women voters about why the military was important. And the person who was in that role actually wrote up the initial plan for the Women's Army Corps. And then throughout the 20s and the 30s, there had been different attempts to get that passed in the U.S. Congress to actually have a women's branch be officially established, and it always got stuck at some point. So even when Rep. Edith Norse Rogers introduced the legislation in early 1942, right after Pearl Harbor, it was even tough going. I think it barely passed the House, and that was in March of 42, and then it passed the Senate in May. FDR signed it into law in May, and basically from the middle of May until middle of July, when the first officer training class started, is when you had 30,000 women applying and picking and choosing all the people who would be in that first class of officers, which was about 440 women, I believe.
I mean, that their lot went, but the number that actually qualified as officers was, as you say, 400 from 30,000. And there was a lot of opposition for women being involved. And we'll touch on, of course, the opposition about black women being involved. But there are some key supporters as well. When I had Catherine Landek on last year, or was it the beginning of this year, about the WASP pilots, you know, Eleanor Roosevelt particularly is kind of a supporter. So that without some people in high places supporting these initiatives, it's not going to get off the ground. We know that from modern politics today. You've got to have your kind of your ambassador for it. So there are some people who are behind the scheme. But when we don't, this isn't a show about the WAC generally. It's a show about this particular unit, and we could spend ages just talking about the WAC. But we have a clear heroine at the beginning of the history of this unit here, and I'll get the PowerPoint ready to and well I'll do it now. So Charity Adams Early. So tell us about this lady here. Some people won't have heard of her, some will, because she is about as important in the history as anybody else.
Yes, Charity Adams Early, and I usually refer to her as Charity Adams, given the period of time was before she got married. She is a school teacher from South Carolina who had been teaching for about 4 years when she received a letter inviting her to join the Women's Army Corps. In terms of the first 40 women that were in that initial officer training class, half of them were selected by figures in the background like Mary McLeod Bethune, W.B. Du Bois, advocating, speaking to university presidents, HBCU presidents. Do you know anybody who's a stellar example who would be good for this? And so they were getting invitations. Some people were recruited more traditionally, but in Charity's case, she was invited. And she actually has an interesting story because she was in graduate school that summer in Ohio. And she basically at one point had to go from Ohio, when she was accepted, hop on a train to South Carolina, drop off all her stuff, and literally get on the very next train to go back to Ohio to report to training on time. She is considered the first Black WAC officer because at the time her last name was Adams, so everything with the Army was alphabetical. So she was the first one to be pinned when they finished training. And then she basically stayed at Fort Des Moines in Iowa, which is in the middle of the United States, if you're not familiar with the geography. And she basically led the training for all the incoming enlisted women, as well as she moved up the ranks a little bit in terms of being part of the headquarters staff. In late 44, she receives a phone call basically asking her, so would you like to lead a group of women over to Europe? And of course her answer was hell yes. And so she basically handpicked all her officers because she had trained everybody. She either trained with them in that initial class or she trained them subsequently at her time at Fort Des Moines. And she and her executive officer actually flew over to Europe and got things ready when they were in England. And then the rest of the group sailed over. Her most famous antic, I guess, is the time that she told a general off in front of everybody because he had ordered to have a review. And the way that their operation worked, it was a 24-hour operation. So they had it where people slept one shift, worked one shift, and then kind of just recovered a little bit. And so at the time, I think only one shift was available to review, and he demanded that work be stopped and that everybody be presented to him. And she refused because it was against their particular orders and mission. And he said that if she didn't, that he would replace her with a white officer, specifically a white officer, to show her how to do it and get her demoted. To which she said, "Over my dead body, sir."
Mm.
And the reason why it was important that he had said that he would get somebody white to replace her is because that was a violation of basically all the policy, where even though there was racial segregation within the Army at that time, you were never to make any decisions based on race. And when he said that, basically she was able to get out of a court martial.
Wow.
And he
so I mean, right at the beginning, there's hurdles to overcome, and there's people around this or that don't want this to succeed. So to be clear, so when the first African Americans became involved, joined the WAC, we're talking about a postal unit that they became, but the becoming a postal unit came later. What was?
Yes.
Do we know what their intended role was going to be, or were the Army not sure what they were going to do with them yet?
What they were told in the beginning is that they would be treated just like every other woman within the Corps, that they were basically working administrative jobs to help free a man to go over and fight. A lot in general with the WAC, you had a lot of women who were driving in motor pools. They were doing administrative work, clerical work. They were working in the hospitals, doing support work there. They weren't necessarily nursing because that was a whole separate branch.
Yeah.
But in terms of what happened with the Black women that joined, is you have to remember they were experiencing double segregation. So the way the Army was set up, you had to have barracks for the Black soldiers and the white soldiers. And then once the women came, now you had to have barracks and accommodations for the women. Well, then when you have Black women come, now you have to separate them from the men, you have to separate them from the white women. And so a lot of the commanders on these posts were just like, we don't want them. So you had a period of time from like 43 to about 44, you just had a bunch of women at Fort Des Moines, and then as the other training centers opened around the country, who were just drilling all day and sitting twiddling their thumbs, not because they were lazy, but because there was no official assignment. So all they had to do was just keep preparing and getting ready. There was a push to get send them in bits and pieces to different locations and forts that were predominantly African American, like Fort Huachuca in Arizona, but there's only so many that they can take.
Well, and that's the thing, isn't it? You know, they need to really be found a role where they can all go together as one unit because of the segregation issue. You can't, you simply can't put 2 here and 6 there and 8 there. And also, it's just going to make it the potential racism even worse. If at least if they're together, there's, I guess, strength in numbers. You've got that ability to be together. But from the other point of view, if you're a white commander of a base, and you're saying, well, I can't accommodate these women because I can't provide for the segregation. That's kind of a perfect excuse. I mean, they could be hiding their racism behind a logistical thing is we haven't got the ability to change the barracks over. We've got no one to build the barracks. We can't segregate them, so we can't have them. Which means he's kind of got to get out of jail card free, but actually it's covering up racism. So is that something that was going on then, where people are finding reasons to say no, hiding behind bureaucracy, when in fact, really, they just don't want Black women at all.
Yeah, they don't want to deal with it. It's just another headache. And in the times where they do take them, they would give them the most menial, lowest jobs. There's a whole book called Spirit in Their Souls about the incident in Fort Devens in Massachusetts, where basically that whole Black WAC attachment there had a mutiny. They went on strike because they were promised to be given medical training or nursing training, and they're just scrubbing toilets and emptying bedpans all day. And they're just like, I didn't come here for this. You know, I have like so much, I left nursing school to contribute to my country. And so that's a whole nother thing. But you had a lot of people who were misassigned, like even in the among the officers, Dr. Vera Campbell, before the war, she was a podiatrist, or in the UK, I think you guys call them chiropodists. She was a foot doctor. And so she joined up thinking, well, I have this skill set that's perfect for the Army. You know, you have these men marching everywhere. I know how to treat their feet. They had her doing administrative work. They wouldn't let her anywhere near the medical. So the flip side, or the unexpected benefit, is all the Black women who were around her had excellent foot care after all that marching they did. And
it's always a bonus.
Yeah. So, you know, it's just like you see stuff like that and infuriates you, but then you're like, okay, oh, well, I guess it worked out for us.
Because in my prep for this show, because they ended up being the postal unit, and we will, of course, touch on that a bit later on, that gave them a real popularity, because everybody in the Army and the Army Air Corps and the Navy wants their mail. They had a really good, it was good for PR, it was a good job, and a lot has been written about that, as we established. There's lots of books on that, but in many ways I'm more intrigued about that earlier role, when they are, as you said, cleaning toilets, things like that. So where are the women coming from who are joining this unit? And the second part, are any of them just dropping out if they can, because of the conditions and because of the racism? Are there cases of people say, I just can't hack this, and trying to get out of it?
Yes, you had women coming from all over the country. You even had there's one situation where one woman came from New Hampshire in New England, where she happened to be the only Black person in town and didn't really know about segregation, and signed up with her friends and had a very rude awakening when she showed up in Iowa and said, you go over here with the colored people, and your friends go over there. You guys can't be friends anymore. You also had another, there was, her name is escaping me right now. She wound up in the 6888. She was from Nogales in Arizona, right on the Mexican-U.S. border. And she was the daughter of a Black U.S. serviceman and a Mexican-American woman. And she grew up speaking Spanish. She could speak and understand English. She just didn't have to in her environment. And she wound up joining the Army, and they gave her a choice. Well, do you want to be not with the white women, but you can be with the Spanish-speaking unit? There was one in Puerto Rican women in New York, or you can be with the Black women. And she chose to be with the Black women. And they actually rallied around her to help get her English skills up, so that she could understand better and things like that. But they came from everywhere. They came from New York. They came from Georgia. They came from DC, rural. I think it was a rude awakening for the women who came from the North in areas that weren't as segregated, whereas women from down South, it was just like, oh, another day at work.
Yeah, I mean, and that's something that when we've looked at the Tuskegee Airmen and other units like that, is that where you're from in the USA and what you've grown up with, you get used to your own normal. As unfair and unjust as these situations were, they became normal. I've read accounts from some of where they were actually, in some ways, where they'd come from segregation, they were comforted by it in a strange way, because they got used to the system of being, and now they're in a different environment. It was very, very scary, because it's not what you're used to. So this era was difficult. So as I said, did people leave? Did people try?
Yes.
Was there desertion or anything like that?
It wasn't necessarily desertion, but what you had is, when the course first started in 1942, it was actually the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and it was not an official part of the Army. And as they got deeper into the war, they actually switched September 1st, 1943, from the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps to the Women's Army Corps. So as a part of, and with that switch, they were able to be full members of the Army and be eligible for veterans benefits and things like that. But a loophole within that switch is you had a period in the summer of 43 where you could get out, no questions asked, no, if you wanted to. So there were women that were like, later for this, I can go work in a defense industry and make more money and not have people telling me what to do with my life every minute of the day. So that did happen. And some women did stay.
Because, and that's clear that this is not the only role for Black women in World War II. There are others, albeit often at the bottom end of everything and with the lowest wages and the longest hours. But they can work in factories, they can work in ordnance plants, and so it's not the single thing they can do for the war effort. But of course, there is a prestige about being part of the Army and being part, wearing a uniform and actually doing a really direct, proactive role for your country. And therefore that's important. So while these women are toiling away with these awful conditions, with the Army not quite knowing what to do with them, and in 43, this is coinciding, I'm going to be the military historian now, with the building up of the massive, great arsenal of democracy that we now know was behind Operation Overlord and the invasion of Italy and so on and so forth. And by this point, the US has got the V-mail system, it's got their mail back home system, but it's so good. There's so much stuff now being shipped back and forth that it's becoming a massive, great problem to keep up with the demand of this. I mean, I did a show about the loss of Glenn Miller November last year, and about the fact that even the army bands are recording special victory discs recorded by musicians that are being sent out to Marines on Guadalcanal. They're being sent to army bases in England, and they're promising, the more things they promise to GIs. You're going to have weekly mail, you're going to have this, you're going to have that, you're going to have cakes from home. The more you promise that, you've got to back it up with the actual production. And so there's a growing problem in the ETO of mail. So what I'm interested in is, did the 6888 look for a problem that they found? How did the merging of these things come together? There's a need for mail to be delivered, and there's a black unit that needs a job. How did that connection get made, and who made it?
Well, throughout the course of from the very beginning, you had black leaders in the background saying, send these women overseas. We want them to go overseas. We want them to get better jobs. So that was going on the whole time. And, they're giving excuses and things like that. It would be a PR nightmare if they dropped them somewhere too dangerous and like a whole unit gets wiped out or things like that. But in terms of this particular situation and that backup that they encountered when they arrived, it's actually as a result of D-Day, because and you can fill in the gaps for me too, because I don't know, you probably know more than I do about the other side.
I know a little bit about D-Day,
yeah, just a little. But what happened is, the whole attitude after D-Day was like, oh, the war is over, in a couple weeks, so don't worry about sorting the mail or getting it out to guys, because everybody's moving around everywhere. We need you on the battlefields because, we're almost done. And that actually also affected with supplies, because they're like, we don't need to send them winter coats. The war will be over by, Thanksgiving. So that's why you have the Battle of the Bulge, and they're fighting in their summer uniforms and things like that. So you have all this happening. So you have basically from, I'll say, August to Christmas, the mail's not a big deal because the war is going to be over any day now. And so then you look up and you realize that in Birmingham, you have 6 hangars full of mail, ceiling to floor to ceiling. You have packages with Christmas goodies because you promised, oh, we can send cakes and goodies to our boys over there. So they're just sitting there and the rats are eating it up and things like that. And in the background, you have all these women sitting here in Fort Des Moines and at these various locations. It's time to let these women show what they can do. So that's kind of how these black women in the mail happened. Because once you come to January 1st, 1945, and the war is still going on, you have to deal with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and this is, we've done other shows on World War II TV about the Hurtgen Forest and the Battle of the Bulge and all these events that happen over the winter, and things don't go so well. Well, Market Garden fails in September as well. So there's all these things. So by the early 45, everybody from Eisenhower down to the lowliest GI, filling up food canteens, has realized the war is going to drag on a bit longer yet. And I suppose morale is at a bit of a low, because although we have now, by February, the Battle of the Bulge is now turned and we've won it and we're pushing towards Germany. But as we've said on many shows, it was the worst winter of the 20th century in terms of weather. It's muddy and cold everywhere, and everyone's just a bit fed up. Everyone wants to go home, the war be over, and go done. So this mail problem is becoming a real situation. And just while we're talking, we've got various pictures of the training of these women back in the USA, and which we'll flick through. So eventually time comes, they're shipping out to England, as you said, that there's people gone there to kind of set things up for them in advance. So sorting mail, it's not the most complicated job in the world, but it is a job you have to do well, or it all screws up. So who brought the sorting mail training to the unit, or did they work out and use it themselves? Obviously, I guess they picked up on however the army was doing it already, and worked from there. Oh, I think we might have internet connection there. Are you still there? Can you still hear me?
still hear you. I can still
Yep.
hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you cut out for a minute there. I thought we gone there.
Okay.
So there's a system in place for the mail, but
Yes.
they ship out to England, and Birmingham is where they're based in London there. So
Mm-hmm.
so what happened when they arrived and there's these massive great warehouses full of mail? Did they invent a new system? Did they just jump in and do it? Explain a little bit about how that worked.
It was a little bit of both. I think some of the women had mail training and from various jobs that they had back in the States, but they didn't know what they were going to do until they got there. So they didn't have like as a unit training in the US and then come over. So they kind of had to figure it out themselves. They basically had, because of the conditions that they lived in Birmingham, if anybody's familiar with that area, they were at the King Edward School, the boys' school, not the girls' school. And so it was a self-contained operation where they sorted the mail, they lived there, they did everything within that small space. So that's why they had the 3 shifts of morning, afternoon, and night, because just to have enough space to even work in the mail sorting area. I think it wasn't the gymnasium. Yeah, it was the gymnasium. They had poor lighting. They had to work around that. They had a very rude awakening when they showed up and the showers were outside and had cold water. They arrived February 14th. So I haven't been to England yet, but I imagine it was fairly cold having to do that. It was just, no central heating or air yet. So it was a big adjustment, but they figured it out. And actually, sorting the mail was complicated because this is from a period where, when you wrote a letter to Johnny, you just wrote Johnny and maybe his unit, and you stuck a stamp on it and sent it off. So they would actually have to go through and figure out of, I think I mentioned in my book, there's like 5,000 Robert Smiths in the U.S. Army in Europe. So when you write Bobby or Bobby Jr. and send it over, they had to have a whole system on how to figure out who that letter belonged to and get it to the right person. They had to, what you're seeing here are the cards. Every single person in the U.S. Army who was in the ETO had one of those cards. Also, everybody who was like Red Cross and support personnel had a card, and so they would have to keep up with those cards, and as units moved, they would have to update those cards. If somebody is deceased, they would have to update cards. If somebody was injured and wound up separated from their unit and now they're somewhere in a hospital in France or in England, you had to update that and reroute things like that. So while the way we think of sorting the mail now isn't necessarily as complicated, you're dealing with some very difficult things and difficult conditions.
And I guess there's people who almost want this unit to fail because there are people
Yes.
higher up who are racist and don't like and sexist, because as you said, it's both things they're dealing with. Although that being said, as we know, there was a little bit more tolerance in England than there was in the USA because we didn't have the segregation. We had much experience of kind of race problems because we just didn't have enough people of a different color for it ever to have been a problem. Our race problems came sort of 10, 15 years after war. So we know things were better there. And also in terms of getting the job right, soldiers want the right mail. They don't want someone else's mail turning up. They don't want important things ending up taking 3 months to get to them. It's something the US Army has begun to rely on, the reliance of the mail. And we're talking, so we might, for our viewers, we're talking about a battalion of at any one time about 600-700 women. Is that about right?
855, including the 31 officers.
And they're doing 3 shifts a day. So it's a pretty much 24-hour operation. And at the peak, they're handling 65,000 pieces of mail per shift.
Yes. And when they arrived, they were given a deadline of 6 months to get it done. They got it done in 3. And that was just for the Birmingham.
Yeah. So within days, they've pretty much picked up the system. They've got to grips with it, and they tackled this problem within half the time the Army had predicted.
Actually, I'd like to back up if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
In terms of that first contingent that showed up, when they left New York, they were actually chased by a U-boat wolf pack when they were on the Ile de France. So they had to deal with that. Then when they finally got to Glasgow, while they were unloading, I think a zip bomb went off. So they basically had to scramble to get on the train. And then the very next day is when they arrive in Birmingham to find out, in 2 days, we're having a parade for General Lee, who was the head of ETO communications. So think about those conditions that they were on. They just got off a boat, so you have sea legs. You're in a completely different place. You show up and you find out the shower you've been thinking about for the last 2 weeks is now outdoors in February, England. And they pulled it off because Charity had told them, oh, these are the best marchers you'll ever see. And they went and did that. And then they went and figured out how to sort the mail.
Wow. And this has come up with Catherine Landick about the WASPs. They have to not just meet the standards of men and white men around. They have to meet them and do better, because there's this pressure to people want them to fail.
Yes.
If you take a unit like the paratroopers or the Rangers, most people want them to succeed because it's exciting. But this is an environment where there are people wanting this to fail because they can say, yeah, this project didn't work. And, you know, we have to look back at some of the things being said in Congress and Senate about, as they would say at the time, Negro troops and this, that, and the other. This is an environment where not many people are behind even these people being in the military at all.
Yes.
And we will touch on that later on, just the legacy of this story and how important this story is. So they get rid of, they've had tricky crossing across the channel. They arrived in Birmingham, and the Midlands in England in the winter is not the nicest place to be necessarily. And, you know, and especially if you're from a nice place like South Carolina or Georgia, and you've got the warmth of a bit, and you're going to cold, dreary, war-torn, no rations England as well. It's England at its kind of worst at this point there. But they do a good job. And the press, I mean, the very fact this film exists is because they must have been noticed by people, because the army don't film things unless there's a reason. They obviously they get spotted as being, hang on, this unit are good. So there is a positive to them being different, because they are different, therefore different makes the news. So at what point do they start becoming recognized as being something a bit special? Who you know, was it the press? Did they have their own press teams with it, or was there some particular journalist who found out about it? What's your feeling on that?
They had their own PR team, public affairs team, but you also had, for lack of a better word, the Negro press that were over there covering the war. So you had, I forget what they called it. It's like the black version of the AP, Associated Press. They had the Negro Associated Press. So they would come over and interview them. And even when they first got off the boat in Glasgow, General Benjamin O. Davis is sitting there waiting for them. So even that would bring press, because him being the only 4-star general, I believe, at the time. And he was his own like rock star celebrity within the black community. So you had that. Plus, it was also the propaganda back home, you know, to keep the morale up, whether you're white or black. You see, we have them over there doing stuff. So that's where I think you get part of that, why these videos even exist.
Yeah, it's a way of keeping people back home, sadly, because we forget that there is, although there's a war to be won, there are race problems in the USA. There are race problems around the world. People are fighting for equality, female, black. Let's not even start on the Japanese Americans in internment camps. There's racial tension within the USA. There are of all as there has been since the year dot, and as there still is today. So a positive image like this is sending multiple messages to multiple people that look what these women are achieving and what can be done with organizations. So and they get so good they end up going to Europe, from England to France. So tell us a bit about that story.
Yes, I think if my timing is right, they basically received their orders or notification that they were going overseas right after FDR passed. Because in my book, I talk about how they arrive on VE Day to everybody cheering and celebrating. And that's actually not quite the truth. Again, Major Adams, she had to go ahead of the group to get everything set up in Rouen. So when she arrived in Europe, in France, she arrived to everybody cheering and not knowing what's going on. And they're like, oh, Germany surrendered. That's awesome. So when they show up, they're in Le Havre. And actually one thing that I made sure to put in my book, because I didn't understand the depth of it coming from an American perspective, is how awful the Allied bombings were to the French. So I have a one character who, she was from a middle class background. She had gone to France before, so she has the shock of going to a bombed out Le Havre and be like, oh my God, what happened here? So they had to go do that and then jump on a train and go to Rouen. And it was a shock to them because they wind up, and I don't speak French, at Caserne Taillander, which is basically was Napoleon's barracks from 100 years prior. And they had to, the German POWs built their bunks, but they had to, they were handed a mattress cover and said, go over there, there's a pile of hay, go ahead and stuff your mattress. You know, they weren't quite used to that. It was a little bit more spread out. There was definitely no indoor heating again, because they show up in early May to middle May. So it's still not quite warm. So they're in these old stone buildings that are a couple hundred years old. The nice thing is there is a little bit more space, so they don't have to do the 24-hour operation. Everybody now works the 1 day shift. So they have a little bit more free time to go around and explore, get to know the French people. One or two, I think, were able to go do day trips to Paris, because at that point they didn't know that they would later go to Paris. So they were able to enjoy being in France, which is a dream for a lot of them. A lot of these women, they even joined the WAC just because they knew there's a possibility of travel. And
you're absolutely right. Le Havre is about an hour and a half drive from me, and it's got a modern cathedral. A cathedral was built after war because the wartime cathedral was destroyed. Although there are a few old buildings there, it's very much like a modern new town, very wide boulevard streets. It's actually quite an attractive town these days, but it's not historic like Rouen is. Rouen, I was there this time last year. Rouen is very, very medieval and quaint and narrow streets and timber buildings, but Le Havre was ruined. But we talk about Paris, because it also is relevant to mention that if they got to go on furlough in Paris for a weekend, Paris, and it had been different during the occupation, but now Paris has been liberated in August 44. Yes. So by the time they're there, it's been 6 months, 7 months of liberation. Paris was a much more multicultural place than some of these women would have seen. Many more Black people have been around in the streets doing things and had positions of entertainment and different things. So that must have been quite a culture shock, but a positive one. Are there accounts of how exciting it was for these women to go to somewhere like Paris?
Oh yeah, they talked about how they went to Paris, they went shopping, they bought perfume, they loaded up on all the stuff that you couldn't necessarily get back home or get or be as affordable. So they talked about how they just had a lovely time in Paris, and that was like the dream of all dreams when they did go. I'm trying to think what else. Since they had more recreation time, they actually had sports teams. So they had a basketball team that competed in tournaments. They had a softball team that competed in tournaments. I think they actually won like the WAC championship or the equivalent of that over there. So they were able to do a lot of things. They did shows. Some of the women were actually performers before they joined the Army. And so they would even go around and perform for different groups and things like that.
I just want to, for the military people watching, look at this little clip here. This is women marching in great coats on grass, so you can't hear, because marching on concrete or stone is easier than marching on grass. Just look at the precision of that marching there. When people say this unit had to be good, they are really they are shit hot there. Let me get the bit with the march again. They are very good at that. Is really precision marching on grass with great coats in the winter. They're shit hot, those ladies there.
And they're about 3 days off the boat. That's the group this is footage from February 15th, I think. And that's when they'd just gotten off the boat 2-3 days ago after being chased by U-boats and dodging bombs and things like that.
I mean, you can absolutely tell that they've been trained to be very professional, very military. Their hair's all up. They're all neat. They're not allowing anybody to criticize them, find any reason to say these women are lesser or not as good as anybody else. They've had to maintain an incredibly high standard there, and so they're still working. The post still has to be delivered. The war is officially over in Europe. It's all going to come to an end at some point because the war is going to wind down. Did the unit reduce in size, or did it all just suddenly end one day?
They, I think going towards the fall of 45, you had women that had basically had enough points to go home. So starting around December is when that first group goes home. I think that's when Charity went home, and that's when you started losing the cohesiveness of the group, because especially once they wind up in Paris, at this point they're not all housed together. They're staying in high-end hotels all over the city, and you just kind of show up at work, go to work, and then you go do your own thing. So in terms, when they talk about if there was a decrease in morale, it was around that particular time period. But there was one big group that left in December, and that's basically the women who had enlisted very early. And then I think the last group came home in March of 46.
Wow, that's a long service. So, and again, with my prep for this, and we're coming to kind of the important part of the show, which is the legacy and kind of just dealing with the subject matter, is that the things you find online are all about what they did in the war. They're all about the, if you like, the cool bit of the history, the delivering mail bit. I'm glad we touched on the difficulties before then, and the latrine duty and the no one wanting them. But now we're getting to the point where the victory that everybody has wanted has been achieved. The Nazis and the Japanese have been defeated, but there's a world to go back to. So how much of a, not an anticlimax, of a disappointment with these women to then go back to a world that frankly hadn't moved on much from where it was a few years ago? Tell us a little bit about how they dealt with that, and were they welcomed back with open arms? Was it straight back to hand in uniform, you're back home and start having babies? How did the public perceive them with the war being over?
They talk about, I think part of it is when they were over in Europe and they saw the response to VE Day and even VJ Day. You saw everybody celebrating and embracing troops and marches down Fifth Avenue and things like that. And some of them might have even been old enough to remember that from World War I. But they say when they got home, it was like you got off a plane and there's somebody standing there, go there. And it's just, nobody. It's just no acknowledgement that, oh, we just came back from a war zone or anything like that. And it's just like, okay, here's your paperwork, go home. And so a lot of them, there's actually a documentary out called The 6888 that was produced by Lincoln Penny Films. And they talk about, it was just like, you kind of did just go home and go back to life, and no one really, it was like, okay, I guess, I did this thing, and now it's time for me to go back and do what I do. But the good thing about their service is that now that they're veterans, they have their GI benefits. A lot of them went on to get their graduate degrees, or the women that under any other circumstances would have had no more than a high school degree went on to get their undergraduate degrees and graduate degrees and have careers that they wouldn't have even thought possible beforehand growing up in the Great Depression.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we have kind of more recently this resurgence culminating, as you said, there's been a documentary or two, there's magazine, Kevin Himmel is watching, has written articles for World War II magazine, and there is now a memorial, but which is beautiful, and it passes my test of a memorial, which means it's good, but it also has information on it. I get really annoyed when a monument comes up that is just a thing. It's a statue, it's a badge, it's an emblem, but there's no information. To me, that I haven't been there, but it passes my test of, you are more informed after looking at that monument about the unit than before you look at it. If a monument doesn't educate as well as commemorate, to me, it has failed partially. So that's a beautiful monument there. So where today, 2021, I mean, it's interesting we're doing this show when there are racism is rearing its ugly head again. It's not gone away. What is the legacy of this women, and in turn, what do you hope for your book? Well, let's deal with that. We'll talk about your book in a minute. What's the legacy you think as a Black woman in America today about the unit?
For me, it's just a sense of pride. Like even after, or while I was going through this process and just learning about like Charity Adams telling a 3-star general, over my dead body, sir, and actually getting away with it. It blew my mind. In 1945, who does that? So just the fact that when they were giving an impossible task multiple times, not just when they were sorting the mail, but basically since the day they walked in, and every time they banded together and they found a creative way to do it, despite the fact that there was obstacles intentionally put in their way, that they were isolated and things like that. So for me as a Black woman today, in terms of seeing experiences that I have like in the workplace and things like that, it gives me a starting place versus oh, I'm just in this awful situation by myself. What do I do? I can go back to these women and say, okay, they were able to make something out of nothing and do extraordinary things. So, and Charity Adams, just her whole career is amazing, and I totally if she does have her memoir out called One Woman's Army, which I thoroughly recommend as an introduction if somebody's interested. But another thing is in the 688 documentary that really hit home for me is this particular monument is in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And when they did the unveiling of it, they had the state rep from Kansas there. And I forget his name, and I apologize for that. But he talks about at the ceremony, it just dawned him in that moment, and you could feel his emotion. I exist because of you ladies, because his parents were of the greatest generation, and his dad was over there. And the way that his mother and father kept their relationship together as just, dating or whatever from high school is those letters. And because they were able to keep the connection with the letters, and even with the stoppage, they got it going again and got the relationship going again. And when his father came home, they were still in love with each other, got married, and had a family. And he literally said, I exist because of you ladies. Thank you. And that's, I'm getting chills now, but
Well, no, that's very important.
Yeah.
I mean, I've interviewed 1,000 World War II veterans, whatever it is, over the years, and when it gets to the story, they all have a story about that letter from home, that word of encouragement they got from their family, and maybe they don't always credit the person who delivered the letter to them, but they know the importance of the letter there. And so, historians could make the point that delivering the mail isn't maybe as important as delivering Spitfires to the front line, but it's all part of the package that led to the victory in World War II. There's a conversation, a sidebar there, started by my other half, Mag. We must mention the three women who were killed.
Yes.
Well, and it was a car accident. It was in Rouen, and it was in 1945. And there was something I tweeted earlier about the show earlier on. Someone said that they didn't expect most of the people in Normandy, the guides, would be aware of these graves. Well, I can tell you, as part of one of the 150 tour guides in Normandy, of whom about half are women, I can pretty much be assured that the guides in Normandy do know about these graves. They do go and point out, well, we have a difficulty these days with the cemetery being roped off because of water problems. But in the days when we could visit graves, I can promise you that the graves of Mary Barlow and Mary Bankston and Dolores Brown are visited. I think, to be honest, when I was a first guide, I think I knew they were women before I knew they were black women. I think it was the fact they were women first, because quite understandably, you can't search the ABMC database by color. You can search by name, by unit, by date, but they don't put in there your racial origin. But then since then, we now have this information. It was a tragic car accident. And they are, in fact, also, for those watching who are interested in Normandy, they are amongst the latest state graves in the cemetery there, because July 45, as the war in Europe was over. So I think there are a few graves beyond that, but they are about the latest dates you get in the cemetery there. And there are people who go and lay flowers and lay flags there, which is nice. So we're going to talk about your book now, because I said at the beginning of this I would ask you about writing a novel rather than writing a conventional military history. And different people read novels perhaps than to read military histories. And I was saying before we went live, even where books are on display in shops is different, where we can all go to the shops again. And novels are often near the doorway. There you go in there, you get the bestsellers, whereas military history, in my experience, is also hidden in the dark cobwebby corner around the back. So your book comes out in August. I'm guessing you want, in a sense, young black women to read it in a way, but everybody to read it as well. But what are your hopes for the book?
First and foremost is to get their story out, and to give a sense of what these women went through, what life was like for Black women in general back during the war, how it applies to us today. Even just for women in general, about how we navigate a world that isn't necessarily designed to be for us. Also, just to talk about women in the military, just to acknowledge the fact that they were there. I've had female veterans, not necessarily of World War II, but later, they're like, I'm so happy to see somebody talk about our experiences, you know, and I'm like, sorry, I'm not actually military. They're like, that's fine. Just to see us is a good thing. I also want to get the word out because here in the United States, there is a push to get the women award, or the unit awarded a congressional gold medal. And I think as of right now, we just lost a couple of the veterans. I think there's only 5 living veterans left. So the basic push is get to talk to, reach out to your senators and your House of Representative members and have them sponsor the bills that are both in the House and the Senate to get this unit the credit and the honor that they deserve, but especially while we still have somebody who is actually in the unit alive. So if that happens out of anything else, I could care less. I would love, you know, bestseller list and that, but if that is the push that gets them their gold medal, I'll be happy with it.
Absolutely. And I think it's important, you know, I don't want to go into too much into modern politics because it's just a rabbit hole we can disappear down, but at the same time, it is important. And I think there's a tendency to promote that Black history isn't also white history. Well, it's all of our history. And this, to me, if there's any lesson we can learn from World War II, is that we were fighting together for a common cause. These Black women were part of the system. They were part of the very bureaucracy that perhaps is also pushing against them as well. Let's not go into too much detail, but there is a precedent for these women. They're trailblazers, that you can fight a cause against the cause, but also be part of the cause. You can be part of the system that you're also protesting against. I'm not articulating it very well, but it's this idea that they are patriotic. They're proud of their country, because I think that's sometimes lost a bit with modern protesting. Is that sometimes it's not seen that they are patriotic. And I don't
without going down that rabbit hole, I would say you're not going to fight for something passionately to be the best that it can be if you didn't love it. And I'll just leave it at that.
You're absolutely right. And you know, it's important history, and that's why, you know, I wanted to do this show, because there are people that maybe didn't know much about this unit and didn't know about some of the struggles and didn't know about what they achieved. And it's a small part of the victory in World War II, as all of the parts are small, but collectively it becomes a very important story. So again, with regards to the historical fiction, what's you know, you say you're not a military historian, so I guess you're playing to your strengths. You know, you've written romances in the past, so I suppose it makes sense to slide into historical fiction first. So I guess that's what you're hoping that people will read it who perhaps aren't interested in military history. See it as not a military story, but a story of just overcoming adversity, if you like.
Yeah. In this story, I basically describe it as it's 2 women who join the Women's Army Corps while they're trying to figure out what to do with themselves when their life plan doesn't work out the way they had hoped for. And you can say that about anybody in this particular time. In a time of war, whatever your life plan wasn't going to work out the way you thought it was. We do deal with one character where her impetus is basically her parents get that she and her mother get that unfortunate visit of "we regret to inform you," and how that influences all her decisions going forward and opportunities. So it's just a way to play with even modern themes and things that are going on now, and juxtaposing it within a different time when maybe it isn't as much of a hot button, or to show we've been dealing with this for a long time. There's if you're up on US news, you know, last summer was a lot of people calling the police on Black people for existing in spaces where they shouldn't have been. That happened in real life, and I put in my book, Charity Adams was on a train with another officer, and a woman called the MPs in and said, "You need to arrest them because they're impersonating officers. There's no way a colored girl could be an officer." So it's like, it's nothing new. And it if anything, it should give, you know, if people are always saying Black people, why are you always bringing it up, or why are you always talking about it? It's because it happens all the time, to the point. And it's like, hopefully by putting it in these different situations, you can get it or empathize with it and just see, you know, or how to even check your own behavior and beliefs about what people can and can't do based on what they look like.
That's it, exactly. That's you know, I'm not going to apologize for being a white middle-aged heterosexual guy, but I am, and my stepdaughter Chloe is living in Paris and is much more progressive and looks upon me and her mum as being a bit old-fashioned in the way we look at things. We're trying to keep up. We are trying to be, but these are eternal problems. There are advantages I have for being male. I don't want to go down too much down that path.
No, that's fine.
It's just when you look at World War II, that some people had an easier way of fighting their country than others, and overcoming Hitler was bad enough. Overcoming racial and sexist hurdles as well before you can even do that to fight Hitler is another matter as well. I think anything that highlights the different struggles is important. So August it comes out. So as always, folks, the link to the book is below. You can find Kaia's website there and find out more about Twitter and what have you. And there's lots of information about this program to get the gold medal given, and there's information about the document. There's a lot of stuff generally. There's YouTube is a great resource for studying what the 6888 did. So I urge you all to go and have a look at that as well. So well, it's been a delight talking to you, and I really hope the book does really well. And thank you for sharing some of the stories about the one other thing that I just realized, one of the photos we didn't show back. I want to talk about this photo there, because during your research there, I skipped it. What's that, and why is that significant?
This I took it's on Piermont Point in New York. It's upstate from New York City, and this is right on the Hudson. And this is the ruins of the dock that they built, where the soldiers would go from Camp Shanks to load onto their boats to go to Europe. Camp Shanks is basically known as Last Stop USA. I believe 75% of every person or U.S. Military person that participated in D-Day went through Camp Shanks, which means they most likely went down this pier and loaded on a boat off of the dock that used to be there.
Yeah, and I have to say, I have heard of Camp Shanks, but I didn't realize it was all down to those couple of piers there. And it is amazing looking at that photo that appears to kind of be in the middle of nowhere. I mean, eventually having about 3 million American soldiers came through Europe or something, and 2/3 of them kind of stepped off a pier there to go to Europe. It's quite an amazing idea. So and Kevin, who has written about the 6888, he's watching it. He says he's enjoyed watching it. So he's one of those white guys like me writing about the unit. Kevin, you'll get on a show again later. You're coming on in June to talk about Patton, aren't you? Yes, Kevin, he says. So anyway, I'll just do a little piece to the camera, and then I'll come back to you in a second. So this concludes our 12 days of shows. So I've got the weekend off, and then on Monday we start Resistance Week. There's some cracking shows all about Cretan resistance. There's the seducing Nazis about the 3 Dutch women. We're talking about the French resistance, and I think the show in some ways I'm most looking forward to is we're discussing the situation in Yugoslavia in World War II, which is just a minefield of complications of goodies and baddies, and the baddies becoming goodies and the goodies becoming baddies, and politics that has still been running on for 60 years after all. So that'll be lots of things to look forward to next week. But right now, it remains for me to thank our guest. So Kaia, it's been really good talking to you. Have you enjoyed it?
Yeah. I had a blast. I love talking about this stuff. My inner geek is happy.
I can tell. Again, without sounding patronizing, your enthusiasm for the subject comes through, and the fact that of all the people we could have had talking about it, I think it's most appropriate that it's you, because the relation, the understanding of the problems, the understanding of the issues is something that's important. So thank you very much for watching. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying I will see you all again next week. If you want to wave it, now's the time to wave. So see everybody. I'll see you next week. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Bye.